The main wheel that I've been using to play F1 24 so far is my Fanatec ClubSport DD+. I have been playing around with some settings to try and improve the feel of the wheel, and I've nailed down some settings that feel really good in this year's game. So in this video I'm going to run through the calibration, the vibration and force feedback settings in F1 24, as well as the Fanatec control panel or Fanalab settings that I'm running on my wheel. The goal of changing these settings in F1 24 is to really just improve our experience with the game. When it comes to updating force feedback settings for a wheel, my main goal is for the wheel to feel as natural and comfortable as possible, while also getting as much information from the force feedback as I can. These settings aren't designed to be esports settings, they're not going to be the fastest settings you'll ever probably come across, but they do make F1 24 feel that bit better. As I mentioned just now, these settings are for a ClubSport DD Plus racing on PC. I'm going to start off with the calibration settings, and then I'm going to move on to the vibration and then the Fanatec control panel Fanalab settings. So the calibration settings are really just designed for you to make adjustments to your wheel and pedals so that you can adjust things like dead zones, saturation to make sure your inputs are being translated correctly in game. With any Fanatec racing wheel, there is one setting that I would recommend changing, and that is the steering linearity. Now before I talk about the linearity, there has been a lot of talk about people adjusting the steering rate with a racing wheel. Now this is a setting that is designed for controllers, and it affects the overall sensitivity of your stick inputs, which with a controller can kind of be hard to dial in and make the steering feel good. I have played about with moving this to the extreme left and right with my Fanatec wheel, and throughout my testing I am convinced this setting does absolutely nothing with the racing wheel. My steering felt exactly the same with it set to its lowest value or set to its highest value. You can play around with this, and some players are saying that it does change things, but I'm really not convinced. You can see on the screen now some footage side by side. Left is steering rate set to its minimum, right is steering rate set to its maximum. Can you see a difference? So for now I would recommend leaving this just alone at 100%. But one setting that does make a definite difference is the steering linearity. Adjusting this will affect your input curve of your steering. Higher values will mean that the initial part of your steering input will translate to less actual in-game steering. This can give you slightly more control over your initial inputs. Now, I like this set to about 5% or so, just to give a little bit of progression to the first little bit of steering input. You'll also see from my settings on screen that I have got some throttle and brake adjustments in there. Now these are just to combat some dead zone issues with my SimuCube pedals, so you may have to adjust these for whichever pedals you're using, but really you should be able to leave them at 0. The brake linearity just gives me slightly more gradual brake control, much like the steering linearity that I just mentioned. Now we can move over to the vibration and force feedback settings in F1 24 itself. So I have set the actual force feedback strength to 100%. I'm going to be changing the peak torque of my wheel via the wheel software itself, so leaving this at 100 is absolutely fine. Now the on-track effects, the rumble strip effects and off-track effects I've all lowered right down. These really send a lot of vibrations and kind of oscillations into your wheel quite aggressively, and it kind of almost just takes away from the force feedback or makes your wheel feel like it's vibrating too heavily. On-track effects of 20 still let you feel some bumps, and if your car's bottoming out, that sort of thing when you're actually on track, kind of the roughness of the surface, but it doesn't shake your wheel too violently when you're just travelling in a straight line. The rumble strip effects, again, I've lowered right down just to 10% this time. The curbs can be quite aggressive. If you hit a large curb, I'm racing around Austria now, if you hit one of these large curves with this set to like 30-40%, it will shake your wheel like crazy. So putting it down to 10 makes those rumble strips kind of almost become a background vibration, and they're it's much easier to attack them without sending your wheel into a hissy fit. The off-track effects, again, if you go off track, you know you're off track, your car may spin out. Having this set right down to 5 just means your wheel is not going to vibrate out of your hands, and it'll be easier to regain control of your car. Now the wheel damper, you can leave at 0, but I've just put 2 in there just to kind of add a little bit of weight from the game. So it's a little bit of damping on your wheel just to dull some of those really crazy vibrations, so stops your wheel feeling too light in the game. Now one setting I would change is the wheel rotation. Typically an F1 car has a rotation of 360 degrees. That's what it was in last year's game, that's what it's been in many games in the past. But in F1 24 they updated the handling, they changed the steering rack, so the default rotation is 400 degrees. That means now with your wheel, if you want to reach max turning input to the right hand side, get to max lock, you have to over rotate your wheel past 180 degrees. This in theory gives you more steering input to play with and kind of makes your steering feel a little bit more progressive. You have more control over it. But the downside of this is you need to rotate your steering wheel a lot more to reach the same input you would in previous games. If you're throwing your car left and right really fast, this can mean applying a lot more input. So lowering this back down will bring it closer to the 360 degrees, so 180 in either direction that we had before. The reason I haven't gone with 360 degrees is because this new handling model in F1 24 is incredibly pointy. If you turn your steering wheel, your car is just going to turn into that corner incredibly fast. And this can lead to over rotation. It can make the handling feel a bit harder to control than before. And you may experience a lot of kind of off throttle oversteer moments or spins mid corner. Now, if you're an esports driver, you're going for top time trial times, setting this down to 360 or even lower may be the best way to go, because essentially it's really just increasing your sensitivity. But if you're trying to create a realistic experience or something that's just quite nice to drive or easy to handle, keeping this between 360 and 400 degrees I think is the way to go. So I've settled on 380 degrees. It gives a little bit more sensitivity than the default 400, but not as much as you get out of 360, making your car just a little bit more compliant and easy to drive. Now we have the settings which you can change in the tuning menu on your wheel. You can change them via the Fanatec control panel or through Fanalab. The first thing to do is match your sensitivity to the max rotation you chose in game. So for me, 380 degrees, I'll match that here. Then the majority of these settings are actually set to default and it feels really good. The things I have changed is the force feedback strength. So I've gone with a value of 60. And this brings the peak torque of my ClubSport DD Plus down to 9 Newton meters, which for me is just about spot on. It ensures that the wheel isn't just too heavy, which wears you out through a whole race, but it still gives you a lot of force feedback information. If you're racing with the ClubSport DD or even a GT DD Pro, you may want to increase this. Again, so you're kind of getting towards that 9-10 Newton meter figure. I mean, with a GT DD Pro or CSL DD, the max you'll be able to hit is 8 Newton meters. And in that scenario, I would probably recommend running your wheel at 100% force feedback strength. The only other thing I've changed is the natural damper, reducing this down to 40% away from, I think the default is 50. This just kind of reduces a little bit more of that natural sort of damping weight in your wheel. And that will round out my Fanatec ClubSport DD Plus settings for F1 24. I've played about with various different combinations of different settings, and these are the ones that just work for me. They create a car which I feel is quite comfortable to drive rather than being overly aggressive or overly pointy and oversteer happy. But let me know in the comments below what your settings are, what you're using, whether you prefer it being a little bit more sensitive, a little bit less sensitive. Let me know in the comments below. As always, if you're enjoying these videos, consider hitting the like button or subscribing, as that will just really help our channel grow and allow this video to be seen by others. But for now guys, enjoy F1 24 and I will see you on track.